where every clue hides a secret, and every secret has a story.
A leather-bound book struck the ladder's rung and fell into Elias Harrow's hands before he could steady his foot. The note tucked into its boards was folded twice and bore, in a hurried hand, his name. Suspicion flared in him as he slit the seal with his thumbnail and found a single sentence written across the top, an instruction and a warning at once. He read the line aloud without meaning Todo not trust the ledger on the steward's table. Elias pressed the paper flat on the lamplight and felt the word trust tighten like a hinge in his chest. He did not step back. He had come to the West Stacks for cataloging, for ink and order, not for secrets. He kept his hand on the ladder rail and set his spectacles with the other, the habitual movements that measured a man's steadiness. Elias Harrow was 34 and wore his waistcoat buttoned, a fountain pen tucked into the inside pocket of his satchel. His right index finger still bore the dark crescent of an old ink stain. He crossed to the reading table and placed the book and the note side by side. His actions were calculated. His face remained long and composed, but his fingers trembled when he smoothed the manuscript's brittle edge. The suspicion in him moved his hands before he let his voice name possibilities. Beatrice. He called, low enough that the stacks would hold the sound. Come here. He left the ladder and walked with measured steps. The library's lamps cast bands of warm light across the carpet. Elias kept his eyes on the book and the note. Within the first minutes he had decided the problem. Someone had made the secrecy of the restricted rooms personal. Someone wanted him to know that the ledger might not be what it seemed. Beatrice Whitcombe arrived with her usual hush. Her shawl lay folded across one arm. Elias, she said, and her voice was steady but short. She had a set of brass keys on a chain at her belt and a pencil stuck behind her ear. She did not ask what had happened. She only watched the note on the table and then the manuscript, eyes narrowing in a way that sharpened the angles of her lined face. This was behind a false binding. Elias and set the book between them. It fell when I brushed the second shelf. The note was folded inside. He did not show her the line about the ledger until she reached for it. He watched the small gestures, Beatrice's fingers trailing along the spine, the way she pressed thumb and forefinger together as if testing whether the paper would crumble. Beatrice read the line aloud in a voice that kept its "Do not trust the ledger on the steward's table." She turned the paper, so the lamplight caught the slant of the handwriting. Elias. You know, some things are kept from most readers for good reason. Why would someone address you? Elias leaned forward and said, because I read names. Because I look for what is missing. Because someone believes I will follow their hint where others will not. He kept his sentences brief. His mouth set into the practiced crease he used when cataloging difficult marginalia. He pressed his thumb to his lip, a mannerism he used when thinking aloud. Beatrice's jaw tightened. You are talking about the restricted ledgers. We have rules. She moved a brass key on its chain and set it on the table as if it were a tool of argumentals. Do not exist to punish curiosity. Elias. They exist to prevent harm. He met her eyes. Tell me why a manuscript by Ambrose L. Penrose is hidden behind a false binding. That name was not idle. Ambrose L. Penrose was a vanished author whose portrait hung in an oval frame within the library. His portrait had been a fixture for years, a pallid face in an indigo coat. The name itself carried a charge. Beatrice's fingers stopped on the key. Her watchful face betrayed something like a pause that would not be acknowledged as guilt. Beatrice answered with a guarded brevity. Penrose wrote unsettled things. Some patrons found them dangerous. He attracted attention he did not deserve. Elias took the manuscript in both hands and laid it open on the table. The pages were brittle and smelled of glue and rain. He flipped to the margins where parcels of small, cramped script looped around sentences. He tapped a line near the bottom and said, "There are ciphered marks." He traced a curling leaf, names in the margins in a hand that imitates his own. that looked like an index to people and rooms. His voice tightened. His body leaned toward the page. Beatrice watched him work. Elias, you must not pry. You do not know what opening such things will bring here. He did not look up. I understand consequence, Beatrice. I also understand when a book is giving me directions. Elias bent closer and read aloud the cipher, as if testing words on air. The ink had been pressed with force, as if the writer had meant the marks to be felt as much as seen. Hair erased the names in the north room. He set the page down and tapped the margin with his fingertip and rose. Refers to a room where names have been erased. Beatrice's hand tightened on the pencil behind her ear until the wood creaked. She breathed out a small sound and then said, the restricted stacks were closed for a time. People who asked for access were turned away. That is all I will say here. Elias pushed the manuscript toward her, and the lamplight caught the neatness of Ambrose's black ink. Give me the brass key. Let me see the restricted stacks. If the note warns about the ledger, then whatever is there could affect more than this library. He did not ask permission. He pressed his question like the tip of his pen against a page. There followed a fast exchange. Beatrice, you cannot go in alone. Elias, I will not. Beatrice, you do not understand what it will mean if the ledger is misread. Elias, then make me understand. Unlock it. Let me see. Their voices were short and clipped. When two characters argued, the room filled with quick turns of speech that matched the requirement of rapid back and forth. Beatrice named him by name in each sentence, so there would be no mistaking who was addressed. Elias, Beatrice. I will not have this building's order broken because you imagine a wrong. Beatrice, he answered, give me the key. I will not break order. I will look. He placed his hand over the key on the table. She hesitated with her fingers on the chain. The brass warmed under his palm. Her watch said the same as her face. She had the power to keep the ledger sealed or to open it. Her hands trembled with the admission. The library's policies sat like weight on the chain. Then she gave the key. One person stays with the door. She said, do you promise you will not remove anything from the room without my knowledge? I promise, Elias. They crossed the reading alcove together. The brass door to the restricted stacks was oiled and heavy. Elias held the key and watched Beatrice's shoulders as she fit the key into the lock. The action felt ceremonial. The key turned with an old, reluctant sound, and the door swung inward on a spring that released dust into the lamplight. Cold air spilled from the stacks and carried the scent of beeswax, old glue, and a faint metallic tang. Inside, the shelves pressed close. Elias led them along the narrow aisles, one hand on the ladder rail, the other on the satchel strap, steadying his steps. He kept his voice low. The manuscripts marginalia mentioned a ledger on the steward's table near the north room. It named a patron in a way that sounded like accusation. He tapped a corner of the brittle paper. If the ledger contains allegations, someone may have hidden it for protection or for concealment. Beatrice's lips thinned. She, do not say that aloud. Not here. She set her palm lightly along the spine of a shelf, as if keeping the books in place. Elias read aloud a cipher he had just begun to decode. The mark repeats near a name, Malo. He the name slowly. Beatrice's hand withdrew. Malo. She repeated Lord Mallow. The single surname fell into the easel like a stone. Her face changed. Her watchful eyes sharpened. Lord Mallow is a dunner. He sits on committees. He has influence. Elias looked at herders. That mean you hide things for his sake. His voice did not rise, but his jaw tightened until the skin at his temple showed a pale line. He pressed his thumb to his lip and did not finish the question, letting the silence make the accusation real. Beatrice caught the implication. Preserve the library. I do what I must to keep the collection intact. She moved closer. The shawl rustlingy have kept things quiet that would have brought ruin. There was a turning point in the easel as Elias reached for a sealed ledger referenced in the draft. His fingers found a box tied with twine. He lifted the lid. The book inside was heavy and bound in blackened leather. Elias drew it toward the table. Beatrice followed and watched with a guarded expression. When Alias snapped the trimming string and opened the ledger, a loose scrap slid from between the pages and floated to the floor. Alias bent and picked it up. The scrap bore a folded draft in a handwriting that matched the marginalia. He read 3 words and froze, a patron named, a verb of Ereshkigal, and a date. Beatrice's mouth opened. "Where did you find that?" She demanded who you to look in that box. Elias did not answer at once. He unfolded another sheet and found a sentence written there that accused a circle of patrons of arranging disappearances of authors by suppressing their names and funding silence. The words were direct. They bought silence, erased names, ordered absences. He read them aloud, and the thin sound of his voice cut the eisel. Beatrice's face went white enough that the lines at her temple showed. She stepped back and her shawl slipped from her armelius. She said with a force that was almost a whisper, "You must not speak this to anyone." A sudden noise interrupted them. The ladder behind Elias creaked as if under weight. A shelf above them split with a dry, brittle sound and then gave way. Bindings tumbled. Dust fell in sheets, and a pile of old oak struck the floor where Elias had stood moments before. A small cloud of paper and splintered wood rose and settled over the reading table. Elias lunged and grabbed for Beatrice's sleeve. Her hand caught his wrist and held it. They coughed. Elias wiped his face with the back of his hand and found his finger blackened with dust and softened glue. The falling shelf knocked a round tin of sealing wax to the floor, and it rolled under a table. Elias reached for it, and his fingers brushed a dark smudge on the ledger's first page. Ink had bled like a wound along the margin. He realized, with an immediate, physical prickle under his skin, that the ledger had been handled recently. Beatrice moved with quick purpose. She shored the fallen boards with her shoulder and began to stack the loosened bindings to clear a path. Elias assisted, his actions precise and businesslike. Neither spoke of fear. They showed it in the catch of breath and the quick sets of movement. The incident forced a new, small cliffhanger in the chapter's middle. The room almost trapped them. The entry to a deeper secret almost closed. When the dust settled, Elias opened the ledger fully on the steward's table. The handwriting inside began with inventory lists and crossed entries, donations, dates. Midway through, the script changed, the lines grew jagged, the ink rushed. A single paragraph accused a named circle of patrons of paying to erase names from catalogues and to buy the silence of printers. The paragraph stopped mid-sentence, as if the writer had been interrupted. Elias read the unfinished line aloud. They escorted her away, and she did not write again. The line broke on the page. Beatrice's fingers hovered over the ledger. Her knuckles whitened. She herself not to look at the names, but could not help it. Elias pointed to a surname in the list. "Mallow," he said. He kept his voice clipped and deliberate. "Lord Mallow appears here as contributor and as recipient of favors. He is listed with dates that match missing publications." Beatrice looked at him and then looked away. Her palm moved toward the ledger as if to close it and then paused. Her hesitation lasted only a fraction, but Elias registered it as a decision that carried consequences. She had the power to conceal the ledger by putting it back in its box and keying the door, or to bring it to scholars and spark inquiry. The choice held the chapter's moral force. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Beatrice, "If this goes on the record, Lord Mallow's name will be read aloud in committees. He will ask questions. He will demand retribution." She met Elias's eyes and added, "You speak of names as if naming causes nothing. It causes ruin." Elias, her voice was low and precise. Elias folded his hands on the table. "Beatrice, you have preserved this library so authors can be read, whose preservation requires silence if not the public record." He kept his voice even. He wanted to steer the argument toward fact, toward the ledger's pages. Beatrice answered in 3 rapid lines. "He cannot risk the building. We cannot risk families whose names are bound up in this. We must weigh harm." Elias replied with 3 lines back. "We owe authors their record. We must decide whether the ledger preserves truth or enacts a cover-up. We must act on what we find their exchange pinged like stones across still water. Each line named the other and forced an answer. Beatrice's hand finally closed over the ledger. She palmed it and lifted it from the table. Without looking up, she said, "I will take it to the steward's chest. I will seal it where only a committee can debate." Her tone was swift. Her motions were precise. Elias could feel her choice as if a door had moved a fraction. The choice was not final. Elias felt a step of resolve settle in him. "He do not seal it without copying. Let me make a transcript tonight. Let me record the names and the pages before you lock it away." He spoke quickly, making the plea sound like a factual request. Beatrice's hand hesitated. She felt the ledger's weight. "Elias," she said, "if you copy this, if these names reach hands that will not keep silence, what then?" The question was a line with edges. He answered with a small, deliberate motion. He reached into his satchel and produced a narrow strip of paper and a set of spare slips he kept for marginalia. He set them on the table. "He will copy the lines and hide them in places only the careful will find. He said he will not publish. I will not air accusations without proof beyond this ledger. I need more than a single voice. I need others to corroborate." Beatrice looked down at his hands. "You will not publish," she echoed, as if testing the weight of his promise. Her mouth tightened. "And you will tell no one else tonight? Not even the committee? Not even Mr. Randall on the oversight board?" Elias nodded. He felt the emotion that had led him here turn under his ribs. Suspicion shifted into doubt as he questioned what the ledger truly meant, and then into fear when he saw Beatrice's pale face and realized the danger of naming patrons. Then that fear condensed into a pragmatic resolve. He would copy the ledger and pursue corroboration. He began to copy with clean, short lines. The room grew quiet except for the nib on paper. Beatrice sat opposite him and stitched her shawl, hands moving to keep them occupied while the copying took place. The small sound of the pen served as a metronome for their agreement. Elias read aloud each line as he copied it so that someone else would witness the words, even as the words themselves were transcribed. He named each patron aloud, and Beatrice repeated a surname when he asked for confirmation. Halfway through the transcription, a second scrap fell from between pages and landed on Elias's palm. It contained a single sentence in Ambrose Penrose's hand that changed what they had thought, a reference not only to patrons but to an erasure of names within the library itself, a room where catalogues had been altered. Penrose's sentence ended with a place name, North Organ Chamber. Elias looked up. The small cliffhanger struck at mid-chapter. This new detail suggested the library itself contained a physical room where names were literally erased from records. Beatrice's reaction altered the path of the afternoon. Her breath shortened, and she pushed her spectacles up the bridge of her nose with a trembling finger. "The North Organ Chamber has been sealed for decades," she said. "No one uses it. No one goes there." Her voice was a fast whisper. The implication opened another door of danger. Elias stood and gathered the slips. He felt the ledger's weight turning back into something dangerous. "Than we go there tomorrow morning," he said plainly. "We'll examine the chamber. If Penrose left more notes, they will point to how names were altered. We will find proof, or we will find a reason not to trust this book." His resolve now carried a measured determination. Beatrice folded the ledger and set it into its box. She fastened the twine and set the brass key back on her chain. The action was decisive. Then she did something Elias had not expected. She placed the manuscript by Ambrose's portrait within the box on top of the ledger. Her fingers lingered on the portrait's frame as if listening to an old sound. Elias watched her move, and in that watching he sensed that her decision had been taken not from cowardice, but from a different calculation. She defended readers and the building's continuity. The ledger's contents threatened that continuity. Outside the restricted stacks, the lamp across the alcove threw a pool of light. Beatrice set the locked box on the steward's table and then looked at Elias. Her voice was softer. "You will not tell Mr. Randall tonight. You will not breathe a name to anyone until morning. You will be careful, she said. Elias held her gaze and felt a final shift in himself, from curiosity to commitment. He folded his hands and said, I will be careful. I will begin in the morning with the organ chamber. I will find Ambrose's drafts and learn what he meant by erased names. He paused and then added, Beatrice, if your past touches Lord Mallow, tell me now. Name the thing that ties you to that name. Beatrice swallowed. She looked away and then back at him with a watchful face. Me family once served under the Mallows. My brother made a poor promise 20 years ago. I kept the promise because it kept the library open. I am not proud of it. Her words were short and concrete. She did not use abstractions. She described an event and a choice. Elias placed his palm on the locked box. The ledger slept within. The lamplight struck the brass key at Beatrice's belt and sent a small glint across the table. The chapter closed on a concrete movement. Beatrice slid the key off its chain and set it into Elias's hand for the night. The action a compromise and a transfer of responsibility. He held the key and felt the weight of what had happened. A hidden volume, a warning note, a sealed ledger, an accusation bearing a familiar name. A near trap of falling shelves, and a promise to copy and to pursue proof. Beatrice stepped back and closed the brass door to the restricted stacks. The sound of the lock settled in the room like a finality. Elias pocketed the key and folded the slips of copied lines into his inner coat. He left the reading table with his spectacles tucked and his satchel heavier. The concluding image of the chapter was specific and situational. Beatrice placing the ledger in the steward's chest for the night, while Elias walked out into the lamplit courtyard, the brass key warm in his palm, and the note that had begun it all folded back into his pocket. The evening ended with a decision made and a plan set. Morning would find them in the north organ chamber, and their next actions would determine whether names stayed erased or were read aloud once more. Elias slit the folded note and a loose slip slid out and tapped the table. Before he could reach for it, Beatrice Whitcomb pushed through the doorway, her cheeks flushed and a ledger held out like a wound. Suspicion tightened Elias' fingers around the paper. Beatrice's voice came fast. Someone has rubbed an entire shelf's index from the ledger. She said the entry is gone. There was a list here, alias, names removed by hand. That single factual report turned the evening's strange curiosity into an immediate problem. The library's inventory had been tampered with. Elias pushed his spectacles up and let his eyes move across the room. The lamp threw a pool of yellow on the reading table, and a loose ladder creaked above them where, 2 nights before, a leather-bound book had struck the rung and fallen into his hands with his name written inside. Elias folded the new slip and smoothed the note had just opened. He read the ciphered line again aloud in a low voice, careful to keep the syllables clear. Line reads, see Catalogue, Folio 9. Red cipher on margin. His cadence was steady, measured. Beatrice kept her hand on the ledger. Someone took a razor to the page, she said, noted with a nib or tool. Whoever did this used patience, and a steady hand. Elias let the word patience sit between them, and felt suspicion turn toward methodical planning. He pushed the chair back and reached for his satchel. Show me, he said. He moved without theatrics. His motions were precise, the habit of a man who traced margins with his fingertip. They mounted the main ladder together. Beatrice's footsteps were hushed. She kept a palm on the wood rail. The restricted stacks smelled of spine glue and beeswax. Elias felt the ledger under his fingertips, the linen cover slack where someone had rubbed away ink here. Beatrice whispered and pointed. A neat rectangle of paper remained where author names had been. The absence did not hide itself in shadow. It sat like an erased name on a chic, clean and deliberate. Elias reached for his fountain pen and tapped the ledger's edge with the nib, listening for hollow wood. The sound was ordinary, which made the missing names feel all the more planned. Beatrice named the shelf aloud, as if speaking the location would anchor the lost shelf. 12 Victorian poets and essayists. The entries for Penrose, Mallard, Greer gone. Elias' mouth thinned. He repeated the names. He remembered the portrait of Ambrose L. Penrose that hung in the alcove, oval frame, dark indigo suit, the faint quill-shaped scar at his temple. Elias had read Penrose's marginalia in a returned folio the previous week. The handwriting there had a quick stroke and a blunt loop that felt like a signature. Now the ledger pairing suggested hands at work that wanted certain names erased from sight. They descended to the private alcove where Ambrose's portrait dominated the wall. Elias carried the folded slip in one hand and the ledger in the other. The portrait's painted eyes met his. Painted eyes could not stare, yet Elias found himself reading the face as if it might supply a motive. Beatrice rubbed the chain of her brass keys with a thumbie, kept this part of the collection separate for a reason. She did not think anyone would risk a removal. By daylight Elias set the ledger down and opened the returned folio that had come back with fresh marginalia. The ink on the margins was darker than the rest, as if someone had written with a new pen. A note there referenced a framed portrait and included a date that did not match the library's official record. Elias read aloud, "Careful look at the portrait." The ledger was hidden beneath the frame by H. Whitcomb, May 1898. Beatrice's fingers tightened on the book's edge. The name hit both of them with the force of a fact. The shortened entry included the exact letters of her maiden name and a date. Beatrice's mouth moved, then closed. Elias watched her profile. The suspicion in him shifted. A new thought rose that felt like betrayal but then hardened into a question. "Hit without inflection. Did you remove drafts before?" Beatrice answered without hesitating. "Geez. Once, for the library's safety. I took a draft from Ambrose and placed it in cold storage. I thought it dangerous." I cannot say more. Her voice stayed controlled, but small tremors in her hands betrayed the removal of calm. Elias felt an emotion shift, suspicion, then a brief tightening of anger, and then a slower, practical curiosity. He placed the folio on the table and tapped a finger against the margin where Ambrose's handwriting curled. They argued next in short, clipped exchanges. 3 quick lines, then 3 more. "Beatrice, Elias, you said you kept things safe, but someone has been removing names tonight." "I did not scratch ledger entries," she replied. "He removed a draft once. I put it in a locked room. I never touched the catalogue then. Who would erase names by hand?" "Elias, someone who wants the list to read, as if there is nothing to find." Beatrice answered, "Someone who understands our ordering." Their voices moved like tools, testing the seam between them. The argument ended in a fricative silence when Elias found marginalia that matched Ambrose's known loops, but used a sharper pressure, a different ink. They pulled the oval portrait from its nails. Elias gripped the frame edges and found a thin nail hidden under a decorative curl. The frame resisted at first, then came away. Behind Ambrose's painting, the wallpaper had a patch where dust pattern ended abruptly. Elias put his fingers to the frame's back and found loose nails and a thin gap. He pried. The frame yielded a hollow space and, folded into that cavity, a ledger leaf that smelled faintly of pipe smoke and damp paper. Elias' chest tensed. His hands went steady. He unfolded the leaf. The leaf carried a shortened list and a single shorthand entry that used initials and an odd symbol. Elias read the shortened aloud. "Whitcomb removed," he said, "careful with the name." Beatrice's breath made a small sound that could have been relief or fear. "There is my name. So I am in the ledger." I argued with Ambrose about methods. "I took a draft to bar it from reckless publication." The confession arrived in small, factual strokes rather than theatrical plea. "Elias, why would your name be listed as removed?" Beatrice folded her hands. Was recorded as having removed a draft for the library's safety. "I never expected that to be written, as if I were complicit in a disappearance." Elias let that sit. His suspicion shifted again, this time toward complexity. Perhaps Beatrice had motive. Perhaps she had acted to protect. And perhaps someone else had later used her past action as a cover. They examined the ledger leaf under lamplight. A shorthand entry matched an earlier cipher the folded note had given Elias, a reference to folio and stare. Elias remembered the final sentence he had read in the wax-sealed folio the prior week, a torn final chapter addressed to no one that ended with a direction. He felt the memory not as a mood, but as a concrete guide. He whispered the direction aloud. Beneath the spiral stair, the portrait's angle put Ambrose's painted hand near the edge of the frame. The painted fingers like they might have been mid-scribe. Elias' mouth tightened. He felt a new shift, doubt toward those he trusted, then a steady resolve to follow the paper's instructions. Beatrice folded the ledger leaf and hesitated. You must be careful, Elias. That folio we sealed, someone opened it, or someone wrote afterward. I fear there are people who will move to keep certain names invisible. Elias set the leaf into his satchel and stood. Then we must not wait, he said. He moved to the private alcove where the wax-sealed folio had been housed. The door there carried the scent of old beeswax and years of careful handling. Elias worked the seal with a thumbnail the way he had months before when curiosity overcame caution. Beatrice watched him, eyes narrow and quick. The wax cap resisted, then clicked. Elias forced the folio open despite Beatrice's warning. His palms were steady, but his pulse tightened in the throat. He read the torn final chapter on the spot. The sentences were short, direct, and the handwriting had been torn along the edge, as if someone had hastily removed a further paragraph. The last line pointed, "Look beneath the spiral stair. There the ledger keeps its truth." Elias felt the room's air as ordinary. He felt the portrait's painted gaze as an observer. The combination of the physical act and the explicit direction raised the stakes. This was no longer curiosity about vanished names. It was a live instruction to examine a place that might contain contemporary proof. They moved to the spiral stair. Elias went first, his hand on the banister. Beatrice followed with the brass keys clinking against one another. The stairs were tight and worn. The wood gave an old, dry sound underfoot that made Elias listen for other noises. He knelt and found a loose board, then a small wedge between tread and riser. He pried. Under the board lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, damp where rain had crept in from the narrow window. Fresh footprints dusted the underside of the step. The dust pattern had been interrupted within the last hours. Elias' chest jolted. Discovery shifted his emotion from quiet resolve to urgent alarm. He pulled the bundle free and unfolded damp letters, a manuscript fragment, and a slip of paper with a fresh ink notation that matched Ambrose's darker marginalia. Beatrice drew breath and covered her mouth with a hand. Her voice when she spoke was low and quick. Someone was here in the night. Someone with boots small enough to climb the stair without leaving deep prints. They took something and left evidence. She stopped. Elias looked at the manuscript fragment. The torn edge matched the wax-sealed folio's missing part. The fragment carried a sentence that changed how Elias understood the ledger's omissions. It named a patron and a location where manuscripts were moved and listed a time frame that included this month. The specific patron name shifted suspicion outward. This was not only a matter of Beatrice's earlier removal. They spread the letters on the table. One letter bore a hand Elias recognized from the leather-bound book's note. Another was written in a blockier hand with a seal smudged by handling. Elias let each name touch his mind and then set it aside. These are recent. See the ink. It hasn't cracked with age. Beatrice nodded. Someone moved the ledger's entries to hide them after the fact. She said they wanted no trail in the main catalogue. Elias read a page aloud that mentioned a study in which Ambrose had kept drafts. The page directed a search of the private study and supplied a shorthand that matched the ledger leaf found behind the portrait. The details piled into a pattern, marginalia referencing a portrait, an erased catalogue entry, a hidden ledger behind Ambrose's frame. And now a bundle beneath the stairs with manuscripts pointing to a private study. The pattern narrowed suspect lists, but broadened danger. Someone had recent access to the house and knowledge of the library's layout. Beatrice straightened and handed Elias a brass key. "The one that fit Ambrose's private study. Take this. She said he will prepare the inventory for what remains here. Keep the letters close. Do not trust the catalogue until you see what is inside his study." Elias looked at the key and then at her face. He noticed the faint crescent birthmark near her ear as she spoke. Small physical facts steadied him. He accepted the key and slid it into his coat pocket. He felt the weight of the brass against his thigh and the weight of a new responsibility settle into action. The emotion within him slid again from alarm to a controlled determination. Before dawn, Elias walked the corridor to Ambrose's private study. He checked the latch, inserted the brass key, and turned it slowly. The door opened on a room that smelled of rain and metal. Ambrose's silver quill lay on the desk, damp with recent handling, and a ribbon-bound draft rested in a tray. Elias touched the quill, and a smear of fresh ink transferred to his fingertip. The ink matched the darker strokes he had seen in the marginalia. He read the draft's last lines and found a specific line naming the person who had argued with Ambrose in 1898. The sentence altered how he viewed a past argument and suggested that the removal of drafts had not only been protective, but might have concealed disputes that later became motives. Elias boxed the ribbon-bound draft and sealed it with a thin strip of wax. He wrote a careful note to Beatrice and placed it on the desk. He carried the papers back to the main library where Beatrice stood by the window arranging the remaining ledgers. The dawn light cut the panes into strips across the floor. The spires of Oxford blurred through rain. Elias set the wrapped draft down and met her icy found footprints beneath the stair and fresh ink on the quill. Elias, someone recent handled these materials. The trace points to a visitor in the last few nights. We have names now that suggest a patron could be involved. Beatrice's shoulders moved in a small exhale. Then we must catalogue what is left and lock the stacks to all but ourselves. She said we'll need to record every movement. Elias felt his mind narrow into logistics. Who had keys? Who had motive? Which patrons had both? Suspicion remained the root of his decisions, but now it worked with method and the physical evidence they had uncovered. He tested his memory against the ledger leaf again and remembered the leather-bound book that had fallen from the ladder in Chapter 1, its note bearing his name. The memory was not abstract. He could picture where the book had struck the wood, the small tear in the binding, the way he had used his thumbnail to slit the seal. That earlier event had begun this line of inquiry. Now the ledger, the portrait, the hidden cache, and Ambrose's private study threaded into a single rote forward. Beatrice unlatched a drawer and drew out a small, folded inventory sheet. She wrote brisk entries and handed the list to Elias. Start at the restricted stacks. She said check shelf 12 for any marks. Then trace who has borrowed from Ambrose's listings in the past month. Elias nodded and tucked the list into his coat. He felt the day's aim clear: follow the physical evidence, record actions, and confront the people whose names recurred. The emotional shifts had carried him from suspicion to alarm and now into a practical, even wary resolve. He moved to the stacks, his satchel heavy with the ledger leaf and the damp letters. At the doorway, Beatrice stopped him with a single sentence. Elias, she said, careful and steady if you find what you think you'll find. Do not act without telling me. Her voice held both warning and appeal. Elias turned and met her gaze. Will tell you, he said. He pocketed the brass key and left the library toward the stacks, where the privacy of paper gave way to the risk of a human confrontation. The morning pressed in through the high windows. At the threshold, Beatrice's hand lingered on the ledger, as if to hold the place between them. They had resolved the chapter's immediate conflict, a visible tampering, a portrait concealing a ledger, and a hidden cache proving recent access. The evidence demanded pursuit, and Beatrice had entrusted Elias with a key and a warning. As Elias closed the library door behind him, the brass key lay cool in his palm, and the ink from Ambrose's quill marked his finger. The next step would be to confront the patrons on the ledger and trace who had motive and means. Beatrice watched him go, then bent to her work. The house settled into its daytime duties, but the list of removed names remained a concrete order to be followed. Beatrice pressed the brass key into Elias' palm and stepped back. He let his fingers close on the cool metal as the front door echoed with the sound of a distant carriage. The folio slipped from Elias Harrow's gloved hand and landed at his feet, pages splayed. A fresh blot of ink stared up, and a folded scrap of paper bore a date 3 nights earlier. Suspicion tightened Elias's fingers around the ladder rung. He forced himself to breathe, and to move suspicion would not become panic if he acted. He hooked his thumb into the folio's spine and climbed down, the ladder's wood creaking under precise weight. The scrap was small, the handwriting hurried. Someone had been in the high stacks within days. That single fact made the library no longer only a place of losses, but a site of recent trespass. Elias kept the scrap against his coat as he crossed the reading room toward the hearth. He stepped over a fallen catalogue card and did not let his gaze linger on the portrait of Ambrose L. Penrose. The portrait had already become a thing he checked without thinking, a face he passed like a clock. Tonight, the portrait's glass reflected the lamplight in a way that looked like an answer and then did not. He found Beatrice Whitcombe at the oak table, sleeves rolled, hands stained with ledger dust. Beatrice looked up once, measured him, and then closed the ledger as if closing a wound you bring trouble. Beatrice. But her voice contained a question rather than a verdict. Beatrice's hands did not still. They smoothed the ledger's cover as though steadying the past. Elias placed the scrap on the table between them. This was behind the folio, he said, dated 3 nights ago. Someone handled these papers recently. Beatrice's eyes tracked the scrap before her mouth moved. Where did you find it? Top shelf, 3rd bay from the west. The folio fell when I reached for a binding. Beatrice picked the paper up with the same care she gave any loose sheet. She read the date and set it down again. We had the ladder pulled last week, she said. I and Mir. Reed have taken it up. Elias felt his suspicion shift under his skin, the hard suspicion loosening into a question aimed at people. Thomas saw a bundle move in the servantry passage last night. Beatrice's mouth tightened. Thomas. He's careful outside the reading room. A lamp guttered, then steadied. The building made the small noises of night. The ledger sat between them, a battered thing Elias had learned to treat as a map. He pushed a corner of the folio beneath the scrap and opened the ledger to a page already worn at the edge. Elias's finger tracked a line where entries had been removed. The margin showed faint impressions where ink had once pressed into paper. He pointed to the blank space as someone erased a shelf. Elias, not physical theft erased. Beatrice's breath left her with a small, sharp sound. Someone has rubbed an entire shelf out of the catalogue, she said. Not removed a volume, rubbed the entry until nothing remained. Elias studied her. Beatrice's hands trembled once and then steadied. Her watchful face folded into a consideration that was almost apology. We agreed to keep some things hidden. She said. He moved papers belonging to one author. I did not tell you because I could not explain the reason. That admission turned suspicion briefly inward toward Beatrice and then outward again as Elias weighed motive. You moved them because you feared what would happen otherwise. Who you to move them? Beatrice folded her hands over the ledger and looked at the room rather than at Elias. No one asked me. I found a note attached to the papers. It instructed me to take them to a safer shelf. I followed the instruction. Elias's doubt wavered into irritation. He set his palm flat on the ledger and leaned closer. Beatrice, you must tell me which author. She named Ambrose L. Penrose, and the name dropped between them like a key. Elias's chest tightened into a knot of something that was equal parts anger and dread. Ambrose, you moved Ambrose's drafts. Beatrice nodded. He moved what I found of Ambrose's second draft. I thought to keep what might be dangerous from being read. Elias remembered the note from chapter 1, the folded paper that had borne his name. and the loose slip that had tapped the table in Chapter 2. Those small incidents were now a thread. In Chapter 1 a volume struck my ladder. In Chapter 2 we found ledger entries erased. Now Ambrose's papers have been shifted. Someone is preparing volumes to be taken or to be hidden, Beatrice inhaled slowly. Her fingers trailed along the spine of the ledgery, did not take them out of anger. She said he did not want to be the one who started a panic. Elias felt a shift in his feeling again. Suspicion moved to a sharper, accusing tension. He rose and walked to the gallery, to Ambrose's oval portrait. The frame's gilt had dulled. The portrait's eyes looked as if they followed him in a measured manner. He set his palm against the wood of the frame and felt, through the varnish and canvas, the small irregularity of old nails and old glue. He allowed, if someone has been here recently, they left a trace. Beatrice joined him with a quiet step. Should not disturb the portrait unless you think Elias. Do you think the portrait hides anything? She did not answer immediately. Beatrice's hand went to her chain of brass keys, and then stayed there. There was a marginal note. She said, a note beside Ambrose's entry. It do not move the portrait unless you must. That instruction pushed Elias's suspicion into resolve. He took one key from her chain. Then we must be very careful. They worked in the gallery beneath the portrait. Elias's fingers found the oval frame's nails. He pried at them with the brass of a key until one came loose. When the portrait tilted forward, old dust spilled like granular dusk. Behind the canvas they found a narrow compartment cut into the wall. Elias reached inside and drew out a torn manuscript leaf and a short strip of paper, inked tight with ciphered notation. The leaf had been torn from a larger sheet. Its margin bore Ambrose's cramped hand and a faint quill smudge. Beatrice made a small sound that might have been relief, or fear left it there on purpose. She said Ambrose arranged things. Elias held the torn leaf to the lamplight. The ciphered notation was not a flourish. It was a set of numbers and a line of words that could be pieced. He pressed his thumb to the blot of ink on his own finger and felt the small, reassuring stick of it. Ambrose left traces. Elias, but why behind the portrait? Why the torn leaf? A new sound cut into the quiet, the soft footfall of Thomas Reed on the stair above, then a breathless voice. Harrow. Harrow, I saw someone. Thomas arrived at the gallery door pale. His apron was dust-streaked as if he had been running. He clutched a small parcel wrapped in plain papyri, was coming down the servants' stair, and I saw a cloaked figure slip past the landing with a parcel bound for the West Stacks. It had the library bindings. They moved quick. Sir Elias, did you catch his face? Thomas shook his head. No, sir. Hood up, bundle tucked. They held a small lamp. I did not get a proper look. Beatrice's hand went to the brass keys as if to check them. Which key is missing now? She asked. Thomas opened his palm to show an empty circle, where a key had been the smallest one. The one for the restricted shelves. A new shift of feeling tightened Elias. The suspicion that had been a private tool hardened into a sense of betrayal aimed at whoever among the staff or household might be involved. Thomas, did you see where the parcel went? Thomas pointed down a corridor that led toward the servants' stair. They went toward the lower courtyard, sir. I thought perhaps out. Elias's reaction was immediate. He strode to the ledger alcove and drew the ledger toward him. He traced the missing entries again and then said, someone has keys, Mr. Reed. Someone with access. That changes our list of suspects. Beatrice's voice came low. I should have told you when I moved Ambrose's things. I should have kept a note. I was afraid of what reading them might do. Elias looked at her. He felt an emotion shift that was not simply suspicion or anger, but a complicated tightening disappointment entangled with understanding. Beatrice, you named Ambrose. You moved one author's papers because of a note. Did the note say why? She opened her mouth and shut it. Her fingers fumbled for the pencil behind her ear. Something of binding truth and a warning to keep certain leaves unread. I thought it meant some line in the draft might cause harm if published. I thought to hide the danger. Elias folded his hands. He thought of the scrap dated 3 nights earlier, of the folio that had fallen open at his boot. A strand of unease braided with resolve if someone is taking bound parcels out, and if Ambrose left ciphered instructions behind his portrait. Then the person handling the papers may follow Ambrose's trail, or be trying to erase it. Beatrice's jaw tightened. She set the ledger down and said, "Then we must know who among the staff had reason to handle restricted volumes in the last week." "Thomas, did you notice anyone else behaving oddly?" Thomas named 2 servants who had new small expenses and 1 junior scholar who had been lingering in the reading room at odd hours. Each name landed like a weight on the table. Ias catalogued them in his head. Could any of them pick the lock to the restricted shelves? Beatrice hesitated. They could find ways. Keys disappear, doors are propped, people are afraid, Mr. Harrow. Fear leads to strange improvisations. Ilias felt the emotion shift again, from watchful suspicion to a colder, investigative focus. We cannot accuse without cause. We must track the parcel. We must follow Ambrose's cipher. He knelt by the portrait compartment and smoothed the torn leaf. The cipher contained a series of numbers and a phrase that read like a direction. Elias copied the notation into the ledger margin with careful script. Ambrose's cipher points to the tower chamber. Beatrice's hand paused on the brass keys. The tower. The stair there is narrow. Only one person goes up at a time. Elias rose. He felt the chapter come to a point. Then I will go up now. He said he will see if Ambrose left anything more. Beatrice reached out. Elias, you will not go alone. The tower is small. If someone waits there, you could be trapped. He looked at her and saw in the set of her jaw that her caution was not merely habit, but the accumulation of an older fear. There was a rapid back and forth between them, then 3 measured lines, each like the striking of a match. Beatrice, I have to know what Ambrose meant. Elias's voice was controlled. Beatrice, stay here with the ledger and Thomas. If there is danger, call for help. Beatrice answered quickly. Will come with you. Thomas protested. I can fetch Mr. Lowell from the caretaker. Beatrice cut him off. No. Not yet. We go quietly. They climbed the spiral. The stair smelled of old wood and wax. The spiral made conversation small. The steps took them upward in a measured rhythm. At the tower landing, the stained glass window threw down a shard of colored light onto the desk. The chair was turned as if for a recent guest. A single quill lay across an open sheet. The paper bore Ambrose's hand. The ink had not fully dried. Elias stepped forward and read the page. It addressed him by name in a terse line and contained a precise instruction. Meet at the Riverside Boathouse at noon on the next market day, and trust no man simply because he is kind. The page then warned that certain volumes, once read aloud, led men to make choices they could not undo. The words were specific, not metaphorical, and they pressed on Elias's attention like a tangible pull. Elias felt a collision of feelings: surprise, the old scholarly thrill of a direct address, and then a cold caution. His hands trembled as he folded the page. He thought of the ledger, of Beatrice's partial confession, of Thomas's sighting. Someone had set this scene as if for a visitor. The quill still bore a smudge. Elias touched the smudge and tasted iron at his fingertips. He nothing at first. Then he looked at the chair, at the turned back, and at the stair that led down. The tower's small window framed the Oxford rooftops. The night pressed in with a sound of distant carts and a dog barking near the river. He felt an emotion shift from curiosity to a tightened readiness. He would follow the instruction, but not unprepared. Back downstairs, the 3 of them formed a plan with quick sentences. Beatrice would keep the ledger and watch the entries. Thomas would check the servants' quarter for any sign of the parcel. Elias would follow the cipher's direction to the tower page and then make the choice whether to go to the rendezvous alone or to bring others. The room held a new arrangement. Suspicion and secrecy had turned into a fragile alliance. Before they separated, Beatrice reached into her shawl and produced a folded notice. Was tucked into Ambrose's drafts when I moved them, she said. Wrote. Do not follow what seems gentle without a knot at the center. I did not know what he meant. Elias read it and folded the line into his memory. The note made the instruction feel less an invitation and more a summons with teeth. We will follow his instruction carefully. We will check on the missing key and watch the servants' passages. We will not let anyone remove more pages. Thomas cleared his throat. Harrow, if I may. Elias nodded. Tell me, Thomas. Swallowed. There was one more thing. When I saw the cloaked figure, they stumbled near the canal and dropped a ribbon of binding. I picked it up. It smelled of ink and rain. Elias took the ribbon and pressed it to his nose. The scent was familiar, ink and rain, the same faint metallic note he associated with Ambrose. Elias turned the ribbon over. On its inner fold was a single impression, a pressed seal that matched the oval portrait's frame. The discovery changed the direction of suspicion again. Rather than random burglars, they faced someone who used Ambrose's marks deliberately. Beatrice looked at the ribbon and then at Elias. He felt resolve settle into the way he held himself. We'll go to the boat house at noon, he said, but not alone. They left the tower in a hush that felt deliberate. The ledger closed with a soft sound. Thomas tucked the ribbon into his apron. Beatrice set the brass keys on the oak table in a circle like a small constellation. Elias folded Ambrose's fresh page and slid it into his breast pocket next to his fountain pen. The paper's edges were warm from handling. Elias locked the portrait back into place and returned the nails with a firm thumb. He glanced once more at Ambrose's face and felt a strange impression of acknowledgement, as if the painted man approved of the attention his traces had drawn. Outside, a carriage passed on the lane and struck up the stone with a steady rhythm. The library's lamps hummed. As they stepped into the corridor, an outer door banged softly, and voices carried from below, 2 voices arguing in the servants' passage. Beatrice paused and then moved toward the sound. Elias followed. The chapter ended with a specific beat. Someone below the staircase called Thomas's name, and the reply was a single, sharp denial. They descended as a group, led by the ledger and a small scrap that had already reshaped their trust. The immediate conflict of the chapter, the discovery of recent handling, the missing key, the cipher, and the summons had been resolved into a plan and a new, precise objective. Dawn would bring the next move, and with it, the answer to whether Ambrose had prepared a warning or a trap. A thumb hooked a loose board and a square of shadow slid free. Gilt spines toppled and a folded scrap slapped the reading table. Suspicion tightened Elias Harrow's fingers around the ladder rail before he eased down. Because the scrap bore handwriting he had seen before, and because the library did not produce surprise Elias, Beatrice called from the doorway as she set down the ledger, and her voice pitched sharp enough to make him look. He unfolded the scrap with a thumb stained by ink and read 3 terse words. Someone is taking names. The line moved him from idle curiosity to urgent motion. Suspicion became purpose. He pushed a folio aside and kept his hand on the scrap. He had felt that same pull since the first volume fell into his hands months earlier, the book that had carried his name folded into its boards. He had followed that paper trail across ledgers and marginalia, and every discovery had tightened his sense that a person or practice moved through the library's stacks like a quiet machine. Tonight that machine had left a warning. Beatrice, Elias, voice low, this scrap is recent. Look at the fold. Beatrice Whitcomb crossed the gallery in measured steps. She kept her shawl wrapped at the throat. Not breathe on it, she said, and her hand hovered above the paper as if a breath could erase the ink. She took the scrap in 2 fingers and read. Someone is taking names, she repeated. Her face closed in a way Elias had learned to read over months. The Guardian's contraction that meant she would prefer secrecy to explanation. The room supplied facts, not theories. The gilt volumes had blank spines, their titles rubbed away or never written. One of them carried Ambrose L. Penrose's marginal cipher, a neat cluster of dots and slashes Elias had catalogued before. The cipher and a small folded sketch of a map tucked between the end papers pointed down toward the basement stacks. Elias let his eyes travel to the spiral stair and felt suspicion shift into determination. You found a cipher, Elias, Beatrice. She did not name Ambrose aloud, but Elias felt the name press against the syllables between themis. Ambrose's hand, a map. It points to the basement. He pulled his spectacles down, pinned the map with fingertip, and the lamplight caught a thin smear of ink on his right index. The stain felt like a marker on his skin of how deep he had sunk into the library's business. She put the ledger between them. You must be careful. I have kept things out of the catalogue, Elias. I have removed names. Her breath came quick for a woman who usually measured it. He did it for a writer once. I did it because someone paid to make them disappear. Elias named the earlier event to anchor them, both. The note that bore my name, Beatrice, closed her eyes. Remember that book? I saw it fall. I thought it was a mistake until I saw the ledger. I have been erasing entries for years. Her admission changed the stakes. Suspicion shifted into doubt. Elias felt his trust wobble. He had come looking for vanished authors as a scholar, to piece together how writers were erased from public memory. Beatrice's confession meant the library itself had been used to hide people and manuscripts, either to protect or to consign them. He needed more than a scrap and a cipher to decide which. He moved the lamp to the reading alcove. Show me the ledger. He did not leave space for a refusal. Beatrice placed the ledger on the table and slid a penciled page toward him. Her pencil hid behind an ear, a habitual motion Elias watched as evidence. The altered page held names with dates. Whole lines had been rubbed away, and the margin carried a faint burn mark like a thumb rubbed over charcoal. At the bottom someone had penciled a list that ended with tonight and a place in the stacks. Beatrice's shoulders tightened. He told you, I would not let dangerous curiosities loose, Elias. There are patrons, people with influence, who prefer some authors to disappear. I was protecting them. I was protecting the books. Protecting them from whom? Elias. He kept his hand on the penciled list. He felt his heart beat as a pressure against the side of his throat. He pressed his thumb to his lip, a mannerism that steadied him when he needed to think. The feeling of suspicion returned, then broadened into urgency. She named a man he had only seen once in the gallery, a shadow in a dinner jacket who viewed manuscripts as property, a patron with tastes for exclusivity. He buys papers and locks them away. Some he burns, some he keeps private. I moved names, Elias. It was the only way to keep the rest safe. Silence pressed between them. Outside, Oxford spires were dark slate against the night. In the library, lamplight made the folio's edges brittle with shadow. Elias thought of Ambrose's portrait in the oval frame, its painted eyes fixed on some distant point. He had traced Ambrose's marginalia before and found patterns that suggested the author left steps for an attentive reader. The cipher was one such step. The map led downward. The ledger ended with tonight. You say you removed names for protection. Elias did. You remove Ambrose. Beatrice's hand found the brass key ring at her waist. He kept Ambrose's manuscripts apart. Yes, for his safety, perhaps, for his privacy. But I did not erase him from his work. Her voice held a strain that sounded like sorrow more than shame. Elias believed the sorrow in her hands, how they traced book spines. His suspicion shifted again, this time toward a kind of resolve. He would go to the basement and find the source of the ledger's final notation. She refused to follow him down the spiral stair. You have my keys, Elias. Take care. I will stay here. I will watch the gallery. If the patron returns, I will not let him pass. He took the brass key, feeling its weight. The spiral stair smelled of damp wood and old glue. He palmed the lamp and descended into cooler air, each creak of a tread like a marked word. He kept his eyes on the edges of the stacks, the places where hands might reach and where a manuscript could disappear. In the basement alcoves, the lectern stood empty where a manuscript should have rested. Elias found the lectern by the rectangle of cleaner dust on the table where a book had sat. Ink-smudged footprints led away from the lectern toward a shuttered stair. The boots had left thin, black crescents on the flagstones, the kind of marking a wet leather sole makes when someone steps through a puddle of ink. He crouched and traced with a fingertip. The smear pulled at his skin like proof. He reached the oval portrait of Ambrose and saw the frame turned face down. Fresh ink smears streaked along its back and through the gilt. Elias turned the portrait slowly with careful hands. The paint surface bore a thin, quill-shaped scar at the temple, the same mark Ambrose's portrait carried in the gallery above. Someone had pushed the frame down and then down into ink. The gesture read as violence to objects, a message meant for any eyes that watched the portrait. At the shuttered stair, Elias paused. The stair led deeper, crawl space tight and half lit by a single, sputtering bulb. He listened. He could hear a breath below, a rustle like paper being folded. He moved with the soft soul patience of a man who had spent long hours among books. The breath sounded again, then a hand slammed a satchel closed. He found the intruder on the narrow spiral, just beneath the stained glass window, a figure hunched and ink-streaked, rifling through a satchel of reclaimed spines. The stranger's hands were black to the knuckles. The satchel opened on a pile of titles half revealed, covers gone, titles replaced by blankness. The intruder looked up with startled haste and mouthed a single word. Stop. Elias did not speak. He moved to intercept. The intruder shoved a manuscript against his chest and tried to shoulder him aside. Their bodies bumped. The narrow stair forced contact. Elias caught the satchel strap with one hand, the manuscript with the other. Ink smudged his sleeve. The intruder struck with a desperate tug. Put it down, Elias. He used the only command he could trust. The man is not a gentle thief, he thought, but someone who believed erasure was mercy. Beatrice arrived at the top of the spiral, her shawl bunched at her fists. Elias, stop, she cried. Her voice cut like a ledger's page. She saw the intruder's face in the bulb's light and took a step back. Who are you? She demanded, voice steady. The intruder's speech came Regidium, correcting the catalogue. I am saving authors, they suffer in public. Private copies spare them. I erase the records so they can be free. Elias' mouth tightened. By stealing their work. By turning names to blanks. A sudden flurry of movement. The intruder swung a shoulder. The manuscript slid. Pages fanned and a loose fragment fluttered free and fell between the stair treads. Elias lunged and grabbed at the fragment. The intruder's free hand found Elias' wrist and made a quick, hard twist. Pain jumped along Elias' forearm. He twisted back, drawing on the small scar above his right eyebrow as a mnemonic. He had learned to move without hesitation. They traded rapid lines in the squeeze of the stair. Elias, take the fragment. Beatrice. Elias, do not let him what? Elias shot back. Run. Burn it. Keep it locked in a room. Protect the author. The intruder answered. Ambrose wanted to be erased. He left the code himself. The claim landed like a stone. Elias' hands found the fragment and his fingers met paper with dampness. The fragment bore a single paragraph in Ambrose's careful script, and then a folded seal. Elias peeled the seal with his thumbnail, the same motion he had used when he opened the note that bore his name. The paragraph described a patron's bargain and a ledger entry that required an erasure for safety. The sentence ended with a place name, Stacks. It named the very shelf where the manuscript should have been. Beatrice stepped forward and confronted the intruder. Who sent you? Who gave you the right? Her hand hovered near the brass keys on her belt. The intruder's voice went small. No one sent me. I decided. I found the ledger and knew what they needed. I could not bear to read what they would do to names. I acted. Elias' suspicion turned into a sharper clarity. He had expected an organized patron, an official buyer. Instead, he faced a private zealot who claimed moral justification for erasing names. The shift made the scene worse, moral pretense layered over theft. The intruder tried to unhook the satchel and push past. Elias grabbed the satchel strap. The intruder twisted his hand free and shoved Elias down the stair by force. Elias recovered by bracing a knee and then hauled the man back. Their shoulders scraped the stone. Beatrice cried, and the sound tightened the moment into its final motion. A scuffle followed that lasted less than a minute, but felt like a long paragraph of effort. Elias' training in handling fragile books taught him to move with precision. He used that training now to seize the manuscript rather than destroy it. The intruder landed against the iron rail. In a single motion, Elias forced the satchel open and slammed his hand into its interior. Fingers closed on cloth and paper. Beatrice reached down and pinned the intruder's wrist with both hands until the man stilled. He gasped at Elias, she said, close and breathless. Take it. Take the fragment. He will not get the names tonight. Elias withdrew the fragment and held it between thumb and forefinger. The paper trembled. He felt a pull like the one he felt when the first book bearing his name had tumbled to his feet months ago. This time the pull contained a new knowledge. The fragment contained a list of authors Ambrose feared and the notation of a patron who collected names. The handwriting suggested not ambivalence but deliberate removal. One line named a person Elias had only glimpsed in the gallery, a man with a steady hand for ledgers and a private taste for purchased rarities. Beatrice kept pressure on the intruder's wrist until he stopped struggling. Name. She demanded, tell me who sent you. The man laughed once, small and sharply, tell you nothing. I give them mercy. I cut their names out so they can breathe free. You stole them, Elias. He felt a coldness behind his ribs that was not purely physical. It was the ledger's absence made literally who erased them from memory. That is not mercy. That is theft. He looked at Ambrose's portrait, now upright and dusted. The painted eyes seemed to watch their hands. Elias thought of the quill-shaped scar at the temple, painted by the artist who had set Ambrose as both subject and witness. The fragment in his hand suggested Ambrose had known of erasure and had left a cipher and map to lead someone trustworthy to what remained. The intruder had not understood that the cipher asked for preservation, not deletion. Beatrice's voice came low. We'll not let him leave. We will keep that fragment safe. We will decide who reads it. Elias nodded. He wrapped the fragment in a sheet of clean paper from his satchel and laid it inside his leather satchel with the care of a man who knew how fragile words could be. They bound the recovered fragment with a strip of linen and then used a length of twine to hold it. The satin of the library lamp cast the knot into high relief. The act itself was a decision to keep certain pages and to conceal them even from the ledger. Their protection would itself be an erasure. They carried the intruder to the librarian's desk. Beatrice produced a small, sealed drawer she had never opened in the years she guarded the library. She had described it to Elias once in passing. Tonight she reached for it with hands that trembled. He never opened this drawer. She said he kept it for the day the ledger demanded punishment or mercy. Elias watched her slot the twined fragment inside the drawer and press it closed. The drawer's brass catch clicked. Beatrice slid the ledger over and set it half open, showing the page that now bore a new blank where a name once was. That blank satisfied no one. It marked the cost of keeping some truths hidden. They argued about what to do next. Elias wanted to publish the recovered fragment and force the ledger's hand to call witnesses and make the patron accountable. Beatrice feared the patron's retaliation. Her face, lit by lamplight, showed lines that spoke of a lifetime of choices made to protect books at the expense of transparency. If we publish Elias, the patron will buy silence in other places. He will move faster. Beatrice tightened her lips. If we hide it, someone else will steal it again. They traded, 3 quick lines of argument short. Imperfectly phrased, but urgent. Elias, you would risk a public reckoning. Beatrice, you would risk a private violence. Then what do we do? Their negotiation produced a choice neither liked. They could not restore the ledger's erased names. They could, however, create a careful record, a sealed register held by 2 hands. They would bind the fragment, note the names in a private codex, and leave a trace in marginalia that only an attentive scholar would follow. It was not exposure. It was a middle ground that traded transparency for survival. Beatrice took out a new vellum sheet and a small, neat pen. "Will record the facts, and we will hide the record where only a trusted reader will find it," she said. Elias watched her write the names in a cipher of their own devising, a cipher that reversed Ambrose's, so that only someone who had followed his steps could decode it. He wrote his own note and slipped it between the vellum and the ledger page. A promise to search for the patron and to follow the trail beyond the library if needed. They worked in silence for a time, punctuated by short exchanges. Elias read aloud passages from the recovered fragment, while Beatrice recorded facts. Their voices were deliberate, cataloging rather than sermonizing. When the register was bound, they slid it into the sealed drawer with the fragment and the ledger's spare page. Elias turned the key in the lock and felt finality click into place. Dawn eased into the gallery with a thin, grey light. The stained glass window showed muted colors. Beatrice wrapped her shawl tight and produced the brass key ring. She handed Elias one key and kept another. "We keep one each," she said. "If anything happens, we will meet at the table. We will not let names disappear without witness." Elias accepted the key. He tucked it into his coat pocket next to his folded library list and the fountain pen he always carried. He felt the weight of the key there, a small, concrete thing that embodied their pact. He thought of Ambrose's portrait and the quill-shaped scar, and wondered whether Ambrose had intended his marginalia to protect or to provoke. He had left steps. Those steps had led Elias into a choice. They set the ledger back into the shelf in a place Beatrice chose, an unremarkable gap between two catalogued rows. Beatrice closed the ledger and slid it in with fingers that trailed across the cloth. The new blank on the page faced inward. The shelf swallowed it. Outside, a footfall sounded on the gravel driven by the dawn. Elias looked up and listened. The knock that came a moment later on the library's outer door was sharp and governed by authority. He put a hand on the brass key in his pocket. Beatrice's eyes met his with the records, she said. Elias moved to the door and opened it a crack. A man in a dark coat stood on the threshold, collar up, rain still beading on his shoulders. He carried a visiting card. He looked at Elias and said plainly, "Harrow, I seek access to a private volume." Elias felt the ledger's blank like a bruise. He stepped back and, without hesitation, asked the man to wait while he fetched Beatrice. The decision was immediate. They would meet force with procedure and keep their careful register intact for now. He closed the door and heard the visitor's footsteps fade into measured patience. He returned to the gallery and set the brass key on the table between the ledger and the portrait. The day had not closed the case. Names remained in danger. The intruder's movements suggested a wider network of private erasure. Yet the recovered fragment rested now in two hands and in a bound register that required a cipher to read. Elias felt an uneasy relief that was not resolution. Beatrice sat down and rested her hands on the ledger. "We did what we could tonight," she said. "We kept a record. We kept a name." Elias nodded. He touched the scar above his eyebrow with a fingertip. The scar took him back to the ladder fall in Chapter 3, and to the book that had struck his foot in Chapter 1. The trail had followed him across months, and now it had led him to a decision that would ripple outward. He looked at Ambrose's portrait once more, and then down at the sealed drawer. The catalogue had a new blank. The ledger had a record hidden within it. A visitor waited at the door. He had a key. He had a promise. The library was still a place of shelter and of danger. Elias stood and placed his ink-stained finger against the ledger's edge, a small, practical gesture that marked his intention. He would follow the patron's trail beyond the rooms of the gentleman's library. He would trace purchases and private rooms and the hands that paid for silence. He would not let erasure become a method without consequence. He tucked the brass key into Beatrice's palm and said, "Watch the records. I will follow the names and return with witnesses." Beatrice closed her fingers around the key with slow certainty. She gave him a brief, guarded smile, then straightened. "Do not trust anyone who speaks of mercy and carries ink on their hands," she said. Elias heard the warning and kept it. At the door, Elias paused and looked back at the gallery one last time. The lamp was low. The portrait looked down. He left the library with the fresh knowledge of who erased names and the small, private record that would stand between vanishment and remembrance. As he stepped into the wet dawn, he carried the bound fragment inside his satchel, and the weight of that paper felt like a charge. Concrete facts had changed hands and choices had been made. The ledger's blank remained a fact to be answered, and the keys between them were now instruments of accountable custody rather than solitary acts of erasure. Elias walked toward the city with a plan to follow receipts, to find the patron who purchased silence, and to bring names back into the light by careful, legal exposure. He moved with the steady gait of a man who had shifted suspicion into action. The day's first bell struck as he left the lane. He kept Ambrose's fragment tucked against his chest and thought of the portrait's painted eyes. He would not let Ambrose's margin become the final voice. He would follow the trace Ambrose left, and he would ask the questions that forced private hands into public view. Behind him, the library settled into its routine. Beatrice's watch resumed, the ledger lay closed, and the drawer stayed locked with 2 keys shared between them. The cost of their choice would show itself in time. But for now they had bound a piece of the past into a record and refused to surrender more names to blankness. Elias walked away with his pen and satchel. The first step was outward, toward addresses mentioned in the fragment. The second was forward, toward witnesses he would summon. The third would be to bring the patron to account. He did not claim certainty of victory. He claimed only the practical steps required to test a theory and the compact with Beatrice to keep names from vanishing without trace. The ledger's blank would not be the final word. At the library table, Beatrice turned the key once more and laid her hand over the brass catch. She whispered a line to no one, a vow as plain as her work-worn pencil behind the ear, to keep books and to keep their traces, even when secrecy had seemed kinder. The dawn light found the ledger's edge. The gallery closed one chapter of danger with a lock and a record. The next chapter of investigation had begun.